Hello everyone and welcome to this Let's Talk Forensic Psychology Today episode. And today we are celebrating World Autism Acceptance Week, which, as you can see from behind us, is running from the 28th of March to the 3rd of April, with Autism Awareness Day being on the 2nd of April. So we just wanted to talk a little bit about autism and thinking about autism in prisons and in what we can do as forensic psychologists. So just to start off with a few statistics, 1 in every 100 people in the UK are on the spectrum. And currently, the National Autistic Society believes that 700,000 people in the UK are diagnosed with autism. And interestingly, 4 times more men, and that includes boys, are diagnosed with autism than women. There's many theories about why that might be, which maybe we could come to as we move on, but it might be a good starting point just to think about what is autism.
Yes, I think it's still quite new in sort of understanding it, really, although it was sort of first described in the early 1940s. So it sort of seems a long time ago, but I think we're still learning a lot about it. And it's sort of seen to be a spectrum of disorders which have shared symptoms rather than one thing that could be easily diagnosed. And it tends to be how the brain works, so that people perceive the world and how they interact with people is different to how some other people might do that. So apparently the word comes from autos, the Greek word, which means self, because people seem to be inside their own world rather than sort of out and, outward looking. They seem to be more inward looking.
Yeah, I found that really fascinating, like a really cool fact.
Yeah, and it sort of describes how people that I've known with it seems to describe them well. And that tends to be they have difficulties in sort of social relationships, social communication and understanding. So people I've spoken to just don't see the world in the same way as I do, for instance. They might talk about, and usually, and I suppose it's like any of us, we don't know how someone else sees it. So it's quite hard to understand then how it would be for someone else. It must be just very difficult when a lot of people expect everybody to see it the same way.
I've recently started a new job where I'm working with people that have been diagnosed with autism. So I've done some quick fire training recently, and in it we did that. There was a section on common myths about autism and some things that people we might be led to believe, and they aren't true. And 3 of them that I found really interesting. One was that autistic people don't feel emotion, and that's completely wrong. Like, we absolutely need to nip that in the bud as a myth. It's a myth.
Yeah.
Autistic people do feel emotions, it's just they have difficulty expressing them. I think it's really dangerous for us as a society to believe that people don't feel emotion. They do. We just need to be able to help them to express it.
Yeah, that's right. And sometimes they're just overwhelmed by the emotions and don't have time to process them before they talk about how they're feeling.
The second one, which I hadn't heard of before, was that autism was caused by the MMR vaccine.
Yeah, that was and I think when the MMR came out, again, I think they might have coincided with people starting to understand autism more. And so it looked like there was a sort of a correlation between the two things. And also, I suppose, because you have the MMR vaccine at around the same time that symptoms might start showing. So I think that's often how it's misattributed to the MMR. And it did make a lot of generations of people really not have that vaccine because there was that worry.
Oh. Yeah, the training made it very clear that lots of studies have been completed, and that absolutely is a myth.
Yeah.
And the final one was that autism runs in families, and that's true. So it is a genetic. It can follow down, and it doesn't necessarily mean it will follow down in exactly the same way or in the same intensity, but it does mean that traits will be similar and passed down through the generations.
And so do they think it is passed down in that way, or is it learned behaviour, do you think?
No, it was a genetic, like, passed down.
Well, that's useful to know, isn't it? Because you do often see it co-occur in families. There was a really interesting programme about Patrick McGuinness's wife, and she had 3 children, I think, and she was sort of concerned about how they all were and how they interacted. So she had the diagnosis for them, and then while she was there thought, oh, well, I'll have the assessment and found out she had it as well, which is really interesting, because I don't think it occurred to her before that she had it. But then what often people will say is, oh, when I look back, I can see I had all the symptoms. So it is really interesting, because I think if it's not causing you a problem, you just think that's your personality and it's not really causing you an issue.
I guess it's that age-old debate, isn't it, around whether labels are helpful or not. And for some, in this training, it gave life stories of people, and for some, it was in these stories they shared about how it was so helpful for them to have to finally make sense of themselves, and they were really proud of it, and they were like, it's kind of my identity now and I'm proud of who I am. Whereas others were like, I don't find it helpful, and I feel that people treat me differently as a result of it, and I don't want them to treat me differently. I guess it's just an individual thing, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely. And it's, we often talked on this channel about not using labels, and actually in this case usually people say, and it's again, it's, you can't totally generalize, but a lot of people say they want to be called autistic people rather than people with autism. That's a common thing I read in books about autism, is that people want to be called autistic people, which is quite interesting, isn't it? I don't know why, it doesn't explain why, but yeah, that's it's a difference in this syndrome, really.
And also the idea of a co-occurring diagnosis. Autistic people have ADHD. There's a link with epilepsy, a link with people with Down syndrome, and also anxiety and trauma. And they can co-occur.
Yeah, and I guess there's a lot of overlap in the symptoms of those things. So I guess people with autism could suffer with anxiety anyway, and then you're not sure if it's a separate diagnosis or it's part of that. Yeah, it's very difficult, isn't it? And that whole thing about diagnosis, you just think, does it help or doesn't it? I think some people find having the diagnosis helps them access services, which they might not have been able to do, and especially children, I think, at schools, because they can often get additional help.
There's also, so they're coming back to this earlier statistic about more men having autism than women. There was lots I read about how women or females are they can hide the symptoms easier than men can. I don't know what that would look like in practice. Like, what does that mean? What does that look like?
No, I mean, this Patrick, I can't think what Patrick Guinness's wife was called, so I don't want to sort of sound it's just because he's the famous one of the two of them. But she said because she was naturally kept quiet, and she sort of, I suppose females can sort of go more in themselves, and people don't.
Christine McGuinness.
Oh, okay. That's, thank you. I don't want to just keep referring to her as someone else's wife. But yeah, she was saying that she could hide the symptoms really behind her personality as being quiet and shy, and maybe that's easier for girls. I don't know.
Yeah. Christine McGuinness did that program where they all stripped off naked on for the Full Monty, and they raised money for cancer.
Yeah, that's right, she did. Yeah,
and I remember her talking about it on there.
Yeah, it's very brave of her, if she's saying that, you know, generally she's very shy, to go and take that step. It's a big step, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, shout out to Christine McGuinness.
Yeah, good for you.
What about autism in prisons then? So I had a quick look before recording this, and the research says that if we apply the same logic to what we know about the statistics in society, we would assume that 1% of people in prison over the whole prison population would be having autism. For me, in my experience, that seems quite low.
Yeah, and again, I guess it depends, because if you've got a co-occurring diagnosis with, for instance, ADHD, there's symptoms of ADHD which could make you, for instance, impulsivity, which may make you more likely to do things without thinking, and possibly in that way commit crime. But it's interesting, because from my experience in prisons, it's been a thing that seems to have suddenly come to the fore in the last few years, and certainly in young persons' prisons, they've got more and more people coming in with that diagnosis, but both either one or the other, or both ADHD and autism, and lots of services, just the prison's almost like not catching up yet. They're still catching up with what they can do about it. Imagining some of the symptoms of that hypersensitivity, and not liking noise and liking routine, they're just not, it's not conducive to being in prison, really, because the noises in prisons are so overwhelming for anybody. And so one person I was working with, he'll start to come out of his cell, and then something will happen. Somebody might open the door, somebody might shout to somebody else, and that's it. I'll go back in his cell and won't come out maybe for a week. You know, it's a very frightening sort of position to be in.
When I've been having a tour around in my new job, some of the patients who are autistic really struggle with quite low level noise in comparison to what I've heard in prison. So with the alarm bells going off, they're not very loud for me, but they're really distressing for people who with autism. And then I thought, in prison, when the alarm goes off, it is so loud, and it reverberates, doesn't it, across it's just so loud. How stressful and distressing that must be for somebody.
Yeah, and you can't predict it. Whereas if somebody, so one person I know, when she was diagnosed at quite a young age, she was sort of just starting school, 5 or 6 when it was diagnosed. And once her school were excellent. So if, for instance, they were doing a fire drill, they would let her go, they tell her they were doing it, and they would let her press the button so she'd know it was going to happen, and she'd have her defenders on and she'd be ready. Whereas if you were just another child in a class who hadn't been diagnosed, that would just be terrifying when the bell goes off like that and people start to run and you wouldn't know what was happening. You're not having time to catch up.
Yeah,
It must be really frightening.
yeah,
That is definitely the thing that the people I work with don't like, is a change in routine when it's not predictable. So some of them have really enjoyed COVID because they've had a regime given to them and it's generally been stuck to, and they've actually been locked in their cells, and they've actually really appreciated that, which is quite opposite to a lot of other people.
yeah,
But they felt actually they could predict that they weren't going to be unlocked, so that was quite helpful to them.
yeah,
And I think they're more anxious now that they're starting to unlock the prisons again.
yeah. There's definitely way more noise as a result of that.
Yeah. So
What, and also I learned that only there's a in the UK, prisons can be autism friendly, autism awareness
yeah.
accreditation, and there's only one in England, which is HMP Feltham.
Yeah, and I think that has to be reapplied for, and that doesn't always happen. And so, yeah, so I think it's a bit like an Enabling Environment Award or things. You have to keep up, making sure you're still doing those things to keep the award. And so lots of young offenders prisons are trying to do that, but it's such a big change. When I went to a young people's prison, and when you look around, just for instance, coming into reception, there was always on the wall was a sheet about bullying. And I thought, well, that's a nice welcome when you come into a prison. This is what you do if you get bullied. And so
Yeah,
it's a sort of things like that make a big difference. So trying to come in and trying to find a welcoming environment, soft colours, not too much noise, things like that when people come in, having just had a journey from somewhere, not even sure where they're going. I think things like that can make a big difference.
yeah.
Lots of people are more aware of it now and are trying to work towards that accreditation. But alongside coming out of COVID and trying to catch up with everything they haven't been doing, I think it's sort of in there amongst too many other things to do.
It is really small changes that can be made to make somebody's
Yeah,
life so much healthier and
yeah,
less distressing, which ultimately is what we should be doing. We're got a duty of care to people.
yeah, definitely. And likewise in schools and young people that are going into, younger than even they're going into prisons. There must be people in other sort of secure accommodation younger than that must be very overwhelmed to suddenly be taken away from their families and placed into some sort of social care. It's trying to make it as understandable to them as possible, really, and give them time to process the information you're giving them.
Yeah,
Because you imagine somebody who has autism and possibly learning difficulties, for instance, and process this amount of information because they just talk about feeling everything is overstimulating to them. So you'd
yeah.
have to sort of give it time to process and think about what's being said to you.
So I think about times in my life when I felt completely overstimulated or overwhelmed, and how it feels completely debilitating, like I can't
Yeah,
do anything. And
yeah,
if that's how people might feel on a daily basis,
mm,
I think that's so sad. Like, we
yeah.
should be able to do, and if there's things that we could do to make people not feel that way, then we really have to think about those things.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think I was the same. I was at a conference the last 2 days, and I came out each evening sort of feeling exhausted. And I was thinking, this must be what it's like for people, because it was sort of such a lot of information we were learning, and you're sort of trying to take it in and process it before you start again the next day. So how that must be for people that are doing that day after day, it
Yeah.
must be really difficult.
In my new role, and I guess also thinking about being a psychologist, I've done some training on autism now, and thinking about how to be as a psychologist. But I think the one thing that I've really taken away is just to ask the person in front of me, what
Mm,
does your diagnosis mean to you and how can I help you? Because I'm
mm,
here to help, and I want to make sure that how I'm helping is the most beneficial to you. So if we need to sit in the dark, or you need me to talk quieter, or whatever, I mean, they're quite low level things, but there's other things that patients have said to me. I need to make sure that I'm doing those. Otherwise, I just feel like that's my role, to be able
yes, definitely.
to understand.
Yeah, and to try to, because each person's going to be very different. Um, as people know, we've got the DFP conference coming up in the summer, and Claire Alley is one of the keynote speakers, and she gave a really clever image of, so she had like a pie that was cut up almost like a pie chart, sliced up, but how every individual is going to be slightly different in different places. So sometimes it might be emotion, sometimes it might be communication, so they're all going to be different. So there's not, everybody with autism is going to be very different. So it's finding out and understanding each individual. So when we're working with people in prison, we tend to try to explain to officers what it might be like, what might help them, because then if they understand what's happening, they're more likely to comply and to feel less anxious themselves. So if they're less anxious, they're less likely to act out or self-harm or do something. So the officers want to help. It's just trying to understand what works best for each individual. So one of the things I've found with training and assessing people is there's a fairly complex assessment that you do with the individual, but then you also have to sort of back that up, interview people in their family, ideally, the primary caregiver from childhood and possibly a sibling, and you're asking them then of how people responded between sort of 4 and 5 years old. So that's quite a difficult thing to remember. If you ask your mum now and said, what did I do? Did I interact with people? Did I talk? Did I use my gestures? All of these things between the ages of 4 and 5. That's quite a difficult thing to remember and think, actually, yeah, did she do that? So you're really having to sort of pinpoint what else happened to them at that time, and then to try and maybe work out maybe birthday parties they went to at school, or changing from nursery to school, all those things, but you're always trying to sort of narrow it down. So it's quite a difficult thing to diagnose and quite a complex thing to actually diagnose. And again, it's whether that helps to make that diagnosis or not. I was asked to do an assessment of somebody who's already been sentenced, and I thought, well, even if I did the assessment, the person's already been sentenced. It wouldn't necessarily mean because they had autism that they wouldn't have done the offence. So it felt that I wasn't sure of the benefit of giving them that unless they particularly wanted that assessment themselves. It wouldn't necessarily help them once they'd been convicted and sentenced. It might have been a mitigation at the time of sentencing, but once people have been sentenced, it wouldn't necessarily help to have that diagnosis. And in fact, some people I've worked with and talked to about having an assessment have said they'd rather not have the label. So it is up to the individual, really.
I mean, it would be fantastic if then there was a prison or a service that they could be sent to that was autism friendly.
Yeah, definitely.
But whilst there's not,
yeah, what would be the benefit, really? But I think it is maybe each environment, each establishment thinking about what can we do to make it just more friendly for everybody, whether you're neurotypical or not, ideally, because it is, the environment is so cold at times and very clinical, and like you say, the noise for anybody really, those noises of doors banging and keys and all of the sound. I think it's for everybody it'd be more pleasant, really.
I wonder with those assessments whether in this day and age, because everything's on the phone, on our phones, and we record and we use our phones a lot, whether in time being able to think about a child's body language or gestures or how they communicated would be a lot easier because everything's stored and archived on our phones.
Yeah, possibly,
yeah.
Assuming you can access it again, because I found, when you've used one, for instance, video recorder years ago, and then suddenly that format doesn't get used anymore, you've got no way of accessing it again. So again, I imagine we've got phones as we have them now, but in 10 years time might be very different, and you might not be able to access that data.
Yeah, that's true.
Really.
That's a really good point.
Each week it's just being aware of how people might be, and often, as you said, just asking, is there anything we can do, not making assumptions about people, that even if they have got that label, it wouldn't necessarily all be the same, so they might have different needs.
Okay, well, as we round out this today episode, just wanted to thank you all for watching and listening, and encourage you to get in touch and come talk to us. We are a lovely bunch that really want to get to know you all, so please do comment and contact us on social media, and we will put information on in the comment section, so go check that out, and a link to the DFP conference. The tickets are available, so come and hear Claire Alley talk and many other wonderful psychologists that are set to talk in Solihull in June. We'd love to meet you all there. So all that's left for us to say is let's talk forensic psychology.